So the neck that I chose for this project is an all parts licensed by Fender replacement Strat neck, and it's kind of based off an early 60s design, 2-piece maple slab rosewood board, vintage 7 1/4 radius, small fret wire, has white plastic dots, but it has white binding as well. So kind of unusual, never really featured on a Stratocaster. Extremely rare to see binding on a Strat. Now I'm going to pre-fit these tuners before the finishing. So I remount the tuner holes because they're a bit undersized. And I do this because I want to make sure that everything fits before finishing. I don't like drilling the holes and reaming everything out after the finishing's done. So I make careful selections on my drill bit sizes so they match the screws that are being installed, because these are very small and they can strip easily. So I drill out 2 sizes, one for the threads and then one for the top part that's non-threaded. And I put depth stops on everything to make sure I don't drill through the headstock. I have done that before. So I do all this now, and you can do this after you're done finishing, and there's some advantages to that. But I like to make sure that they're all fit before I do finishing. It's just less chance of you screwing the finish up, less work for you to do. Now these all parts necks come with standard vintage style nickel silver frets already installed, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with these frets. They're installed and dressed just fine, and you can play as is. But I'm a nut, and I just gotta have my EVO Gold Jescar fretwire on there. It's a bit bigger wire and it's more durable, and it will fit in with the gold hardware theme. So I'm going to take these perfectly good factory frets and rip them all out and install the new fret wire. But what you're seeing here is the same process I would do on any kind of refret. So I have a flat tipped soldering iron, and I have a groove filed in the tip so it rides on top of the fret. Put a little solder on there and run it back and forth, just trying to heat up the fret, swell up the wood a bit, and pull it out with as little possibility for chipping as you can. You don't want to put it on there for very long because, of course, we have plastic binding here, so we don't want to melt the binding. And I take these Stewmac fret nippers. They have flush cut ends meant to get underneath the fret on top of the fretboard itself, and pull them up. So I really carefully just walk it across the fret, pinch them, and pull it out. Now, All Parts does not use any glue whatsoever. A lot of manufacturers will use glue. So when you apply heat, what you're also trying to do is soften the glue that's inside that slot. But since there's no glue in here, these come out pretty easily. And as you can see, there's a little bit of the markings from when they were hammered in from the tangs on the bottom. But very carefully go across each fret. And you want to make sure that you put solder on the tip every few frets. The reason you do this is, first, you want to make sure that there's always solder on there because you can oxidize the fret and it won't accept solder anymore. Also, it helps lubricate the tip so you're going back and forth without slipping. And it helps with the heat transfer from the iron to the actual fret wire itself. And despite what you think, frets are not slid in. The only frets that were slid in are the vintage Fender frets from the 50s to mid-1982. So this is the proper way. You want to pull everything out from the top. That's how everything is done nowadays. So here's all the frets pulled out. You can see some marks from the tangs. And yeah, we had a little bit of damage with some of the ends with the binding. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to take a small scraper. I'm not even going to bend the scraper. I'm just going to lightly brush it over where the binding meets the rosewood and on the side as well, just to make sure that those melted bumps and any marks from the frets are leveled out and we get a nice clean surface to press our frets in. Next, I'm going to take a Stewmac 7 1/4 radius block, and I'm going to stick them 220 grit sandpaper on the bottom, and I use pencil mark to mark the tops to see where I'm sanding, make sure I'm sanding even. Just want to get a really nice, true 7 1/4 rounded surface so the frets will sit nicely. By the way, the cheesy background music that you're listening to right now, the guitar solos were played on this very instrument once it was finished. Well, I mean, obviously once it was finished. So I use the fretboard surface itself to help shape the bottom of the nut because the nut slot itself is rounded just like the fretboard radius at 7 1/4. So I have it cut to about 7 1/4, but I'm just truing it up on the sandpaper. And you see we had a binding issue. The binding came out at the top, but it ended up helping so I can fit this nut in here because I'm going to do something a little different with this nut. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to cut the ends here with a jeweler's file, and I'm going to actually place the nut over the whole width of the fingerboard, but cut those notches out so they fit over the binding. And having that binding loose actually helps with this. So I'm going to finish it up later, but this will give us much more playing surface and give it a really nice, clean, classy look. We'll have to finish these cuts up with a file later, but at least that takes the meat out of the material. So now I'm going to label the nut, how it's positioned, going to have it rough cut, and I'm going to put it in a bag labeled with my parts bin, so when I get to the process and the final assembly, I'll know exactly how it's installed and which guitar it goes to, because I always work on multiple guitars at the same time. Now to fix that binding that came loose is really easy. I'm just taking a few drops of acetone on a spatula, pressing it in between the fingerboard and the binding, taking a binding rubber band and wrapping it around. And the acetone will melt the binding, so just after about a half hour, it's fused back into the wood. It looks better than ever. Can't even tell that it's separated. Now the fret wire that we're going to use is made by Jescar. This is the EVO Gold FW55090, and it's 90 thousandths wide by 55 thousandths tall. So a medium profile wire, a little bit taller than your vintage, but about the same width as a vintage wire. And this is a hypoallergenic fret wire. There's no nickel content, so people with nickel sensitivities can play with this wire, but I just like it because it's gold. Now it comes pre-bent in like a 10.5 radius coil, so what we got to do is we got to rebend it. So trial and error, I bend it, check it, adjust the bender radius. And I had to do this like 5 or 6 times before I finally locked it in. But once I got it to the radius that I want, then I pull it through and run it back and forth, as you'll see here. I take it one side and then run it back before I pull it out. Now, the last 2 inches of each side are going to be kind of unusable because they get bent when they're removed, but most of the wire is good. Now, a tip for EVO Gold or stainless steel, which I have stainless steel wire in the same dimensions, you want to get it bent right at the radius you're going to stall at. You can overbend it a little bit. You can see here after about 5 or 6 tries, I got it a little bit overbent from 7 1/4, but that's okay because we're going to press it home. You just don't want to overbend it too much like you would with nickel silver because it will bounce back on you. So now I'm just nipping the wire for each slot, and I have notches cut into my neck caul for each individual fret. You want to cut a little bit of excess on each side. I'm just taking the Stewmac fret end nippers to cut each one. And now that I have every fret cut to size, I'm going to use a special Tang cutting tool. Now this one's made by Summit in Europe, and it's a very expensive tool. So I do a lot of fret jobs, so I invested in this. So you might not need this tool, but what it does, it has different cartridges for different fret wire. You slide it in, nip it, and it takes the end of the Tang off. So this is great for necks with binding, but I do it on all necks, even if there's not binding, so you don't have those things poking out on the ends. So there's a little bit of a Tang left there, so you will have to file that off, but that gets all those off in a hurry. Now it leaves all these little Tang clippings. Now you gotta be careful when you do this. check your bench. Make sure you remove all this from your work surface because these things will ruin your guitar. I've had it happen before where I missed just one and I scraped the back of my neck up on there. So you can see them kind of fly off all over the place. So you want to make sure before you put your guitar back down that you clear those all out. So I'm going one by one, making sure all the tangs are cut and they clear the bindings so they won't push into them. Now I'm taking just a standard triangle file and chamfering the top. And so what that does is that removes all the tang marks from removing the old frets, and it also provides a nice even top for the new frets to press in and sit even without bulging. So you can see once you chamfer the tops, it removes a lot of those tang marks. And once again, I just clean up the sides. Make sure the slots are cleared of all dust and debris. I'm taking some paper-backed 4000 grit sandpaper, really, really light grit, and just going over the whole thing to make sure everything's really smooth and ready to go. So the neck is completely prepped. It's ready to accept frets. We got a really nice, clean surface, all level, 7 1/4. All the slots are completely cleaned out and ready to begin pressing. So first I'm going to kind of just test fit a fret. And you notice here when you bang one end and you try to bang the other end, it seesaws. Again, this is with a lot of the harder wires. You can't just hammer it in like you would with a nickel silver. You have to kind of go back and forth or it'll seesaw. So that won't be a problem when we press it in. But I'm just checking the slots with my micrometer, making sure that they're deep enough to accept the tang, making sure that they're small enough so it'll hold the fret. You can see overall it's 0.1 inches thick, and then the crown is just right at 55 thousandths, so everything checks out there. So we know that the tang is not deeper than the slots themselves and it won't push out of the fret. So now we're going to start pressing them in. Now, a lot of people use all different types of stuff. They use wood glue, they use CA or super glue. A lot of people use epoxy. I just use Type Bond wood glue. Several reasons. It fills up the slot. It's water soluble. It's easy to work with and wipe away. And it gives you some time to work with the frets in case you have any issues. So I go ahead and fill up the slots with a little spatula there. Pound in the ends just so the fret is sitting upright and it's secured. Center it up and press it home with a 7 1/4 caul. This caul is installed in a drill press, which I don't have anymore. I have an actual dedicated arbor press. But the first one went in pretty nicely. It's sitting flush. So I go ahead and fill that slot in with the wood glue, wipe off the excess with a damp rag, tap in the end just to make sure it's seated properly, and then squeeze it home, and then wipe off the excess. And then rinse and repeat. So just going one at a time. Trying to work fast, but making sure it's accurate. Of course, this video is sped up quite a bit. Press it, wipe it off, check for the fit, make sure it's flush. So here's the first 6 frets, and you can see everything's being pressed very nicely. There's no gaps. Everything's flush with the fingerboard surface. Now, luthiers have all sorts of different ways of installing frets, different methods. There's no right way. There's really dozens of ways to go about this. This is just the particular way that I've used for this neck. And it's a little bit special because you're working with binding. So if you have a bound neck, you can't use the exact same techniques as you would on an unbound neck. But there's no right way. There's just whatever you're experienced with, whatever equipment you have, and your techniques will improve and evolve over time. So that will change. But for this particular neck, I like the wood glue and I'm pressing with the drill press. So here it is. All the frets are glued in, pressed in, and you see there's some overhang, so we just gotta make sure that all of them are properly glued in. There's no hollow sounding frets when you tap them. And here it's next to the maple neck for the other guitar that I'm working on at the same time. So now we gotta nip the ends. So this is another special fret end nipper made by Summit Tools, very expensive tool, made for stainless steel specifically. And you see it's got an offset design where you go on head on, and it's got 2 notches cut in the top, one for medium and one for wide fret wire. Now, I really think this is a useful tool for stainless steel, but it's not the right one for this job because I tried to get up real close, and you can see I'm kind of gouging the actual binding, and I'm not getting the cut that I want off of it. So I didn't want to leave too much space because there's a lot of filing you have to do if you leave too much on the ends, especially with a harder wire like this. But I decided after going about half the neck that, yeah, this is not the one to use. So I went back to my Stewmac fret end nippers with the flush cut ends. And these are not made for harder wire like this, but I've used them on stainless steel jobs and they're still holding up. So I go up to the ends. It's going to leave a little bit of a triangle pattern at the end there, but that gets most of the excess off without marring any of the binding on the ends. So now I'm taking a fret end file, and this again, I'm not trying to be a walking advertisement for Stewmac. I buy a lot of tools from Stewmac, LMII, just because I can't make my own tools. I don't have the experience, so it just makes more sense to buy the pre-made tools because I do a lot of this fret work. So just going over it really slow. And what's great about this file is it'll ride on top of the finish, it'll ride on top of the binding without marring anything, which is really nice. But just trying to get those frets level, and so they're not hanging over the end. Now here's a file that I have since retired. This is made by independent luthier company, and I don't really like the file. It has a 90-degree and 45-degree file in a block. Now, what this does is it puts that angle on the end of the frets so you can bevel it off when you're doing your end fret dressing. But it's way too aggressive, and I don't have the right technique. As you can see, sometimes I'm at an angle at the end of the fretboard and sometimes at the top, and it leads to catastrophe and accidents. So if you're not careful, something bad might happen, like you're gonna see here when you're doing this. Right there, I scraped that hard file across the top. Let's see the instant replay of that. Embarrassingly enough, it's not the first time I've done this, and you can put really bad gouges in the top of the frets. Luckily, we're going to go ahead and do a fret dressing. I want to take some of the crown off anyways, so it's not a big deal. We're gonna level the frets anyways. But I went ahead and finished off the beveling, and then I took some sandpaper to kind of clean up those ends. So in our next video, we're going to focus on finishing the neck. And I had a finish idea that didn't really work out, so I had to go to a plan B. So please stay tuned for plenty more videos in this build series. Like, comment, subscribe. Thank you so much for watching. Please stick here at Bellezza Guitars.